When most of us think of Cuba, we think of tropical weather, pristine beaches, crystal blue water, lush surroundings, and Caribbean food. Cigars, old Havana colonial buildings conjure up images of bygone era and the economy stuck in decade-old automobiles and crumbling infrastructure. But there is a lot more to this island of contradictions, and very little is understood of the fiercely independent nation and its struggle to stay independent. To learn more about this subject, we have with us Dr. Helen Yaffe, senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and the author of We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
You have a fascinating book, and it offers a perspective that most readers don't really get an opportunity to learn more about it. Maybe we can start a little bit about Cuba before the 1959 revolution. How Cuba was and why Cuba's difficulties started with the imperialism and colonialism at least about 70, 80 years before that. So maybe if you can set the stage for us.
Yes, well, Cuba was colonized by Spain and was a key part of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And this really shaped the island's development and international relations. So Cuba was characterized by having sugar plantations, and until very late in the 19th century, those were operated by slave labor. So there was the importations of tens of thousands of people from Africa who worked as slaves in Cuba. The impact of the sugar industry on Cuba can't be underestimated. It's a sort of long-term legacy in terms of the island's dependence on food imports and its inability to continue to provide its own for its own food consumption. The institutionalized racism, oppression, incredible inequality between those who were, part of the elite and benefited either from the sugar industry or related industries. And also that it determined, as the Cuba became independent, finally, at the very end of the 19th century, the sugar industry continued and in fact expanded under the influence of US interests and US capital, US investors who flooded into Cuba in the early 20th century, and it determined the relationship between the United States and Cuba. This characteristic of a Cuban elite, a domestic capitalist class, which is very linked to, dependent on, and integrated into US capital, US interests, and so has a relationship wanting to be very close to the United States. So many of the features that we can see in Cuba and these sorts of recurring themes in history are part of this legacy of Cuba's 400 years, the legacy of colonialism and imperialism.
And during the times of the sugar plantation, you brought out very well in the book that the unemployment level was as high as 80%. Most of the island did not even have electricity, and there was poverty all across, beyond 2 kilometers of Havana.
Yeah, so the sugar harvest is when, the vast majority of Cuban sugar workers, cane cutters, were employed. But at that time, it lasted about 3 to 4 months of the year. And the rest of the year was known in Cuba as El Tiempo Muerto, the dead season. And it literally was the season where Cubans struggled to survive because there was very little, almost no alternative industry or manufacture that wasn't linked to the sugar industry. So people just, they struggled to survive in the period between the sugar industry. And that's why you had endemic unemployment, very, very high rates of unemployment, and of course inequality. You had a scenario in the countryside where the vast majority of the people who lived in the countryside did not own their land or even a small plot of land, and therefore, found it extremely hard to access basic staples, basic foods. And there are some statistics in the book which show, the proportion of Cubans who had access to, eggs, milk, cheese, and so on. Electricity was phenomenally low. So, it's the question of the nature of the Cuban economy pre-1959 revolution is of quite strong debate between historians, academics and commentators, because it's very much linked to the assessment of the Cuban Revolution. So, you know, those who think that Cuba was in, you know, healthy capitalist development, close to what Walt Rostow called the takeoff stage of high mass consumption, those people emphasize the sort of statistics that reflect the reality of the elite, mainly in Havana. You know, GDP per capita was relatively high in Cuba compared to the rest of Latin America, the number of cars per person and medics per person. But what really characterized Cuba was a structural imbalance and incredible inequality between that cosmopolitan Havana. You know, we think of the 1950s as associated with the brothels and casinos and mafia-run elements, and, you know, a tourist destination for US business people and so on. But outside Havana, there were seas of underdevelopment and poverty, and also, as I said, institutionalized racism. So you had beaches that were whites only, you had buses and public spaces that were whites only or blacks only. And that was, you know, that was standard in Cuba.
And that probably sowed the seeds for the revolution. And most people don't understand why Cuba had revolution. And maybe you can explain to us a little bit more how all these things came together in 1959.
Well, those economic relationships and structures that I've described produced a political system that was also dependent on, you know, US basically decision making. And the US, when the Cuban Revolution was close to independence, the Cuban independence was close to independence, most people will know that the US intervened and occupied the island with troops and signed a deal with the Spanish, which Cuba was, the Cuban representatives of the independence forces were not invited to sit around that table. So rightly, understandably, the Cubans complained because they hadn't fought 3 major wars of independence against the Spanish just to become a colony of the United States. So what happened was you also had a trend in the United States that was against the sort of colonial occupation. They saw the United States and its constitution as representing something else and in favor of independence, political independence for nations. So you had a sort of compromise, which is known as the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is an incredibly short document for one which has such enduring and ongoing impact on relations with Cuba and on the history of the region. But the Platt Amendment grants Cuba nominally political sovereignty. So Cuba, you know, becomes an independent republic, but at the same time retains incredible control by the United States over Cuba. It gives the United States the right to intervene militarily whenever their interests are impacted, and they did so. They used and abused that right, intervening in Cuba at least 3 occasions with troops. And so what you have is a political system which is extremely unstable. The US intervenes when it's not happy with the outcome of a so-called election. Elections were very restricted, voting rights and so on. And you have a sort of political governance that you know can only stay as long as it is satisfying the demands and interests of the US, which are motivated by their economic interests. So, you know, you have this incredible character, Batista. He's historically speaking, very interesting. He comes from a poor black background in Cuba. His father was a sharecropper on the same plantation as Fidel Castro's father, who came from Spain, apparently. But Batista is a member of the army, and he is sort of put into a key place to carry out a counter-revolution against the revolution in Cuba of 1933. A very short, short in duration radical government. It's known as the 100-day government for obvious reasons. And that was a coalition of students, intellectuals, and some elements of workers. And this revolution had taken place in 1933 in the context of the Great Depression and a massive slump which hit Latin America extremely hard because, of course, US capital retracted from the region. And this was a period of massive worker uprising throughout Latin America and in Cuba. Soviets were set up in the sugar mills, a very radical trade union for sugar workers, and the influence of communists and socialists within that trade union. So, Batista becomes this reliable figure for the United States. There's different periods of Batista's reign. He rules from behind, he rules from the front, he rules through elections. In 1940, he's elected legitimately as the president of Cuba. He allows 2 members of the Communist Party to join an alliance to have representatives in government, and he stops. They no longer have to be undercover at that point. And then he loses the election in 1944, and he accepts that. So Cuba has this experience of, let's call it parliamentary liberalism or multi-party elections. And it's always worth reminding people that for most Cubans, the system did not work in their interests. It saw in the 1940s a period of unprecedented generalized violence among students in trade unions and so on, a lot of corruption, a lot of government stealing from coffers, a lot of the role of the mafia in Cuba and so on. So Batista comes back in 1952 in a coup that is, supported by the US administration at the time. And in his second go at being the dictator of Cuba, he implements a much more brutal regime during the 1950s. So estimates are that some 20,000 Cubans were killed in the 1950s, through police violence and disappearances and so on. So the revolution is first and foremost a movement, an uprising against the dictatorship. But it has, if you look at the program of the movement for the 26th of July and the other armed revolutionary organizations, because they weren't on their own, so you had the Revolutionary Student Movement and also the Cuban Communist Party, which isn't joining the armed struggle until much later on, until 1958. They start to collaborate with the movement for the 26th of July. But most of the organizations, the sort of revolutionary groups at that point, have as part of their platform a broader remit, which is concerned with the socio-economic situation in Cuba. And at the forefront of their demands are sovereignty and social justice. That is certainly the case with the movement for the 26th of July, which is set up and led by Fidel Castro. And this is very clearly articulated in his famous court defense speech of 1953, "History will absolve me," after the attack on the Moncada barracks, when the attackers are either killed in combat or arrested and rounded up. Many of them were tortured to death. Fidel Castro survived, and he was taken to a court and tried in camera, as they say. But he gave this famous court defense speech, which is later edited and distributed as the program of the movement for the 26th of July, which, as I said, ends up being the leading force in the revolutionary insurrection of the 1950s. So when people are uniting with this movement, they are also uniting, in a sense, with a much broader program of socio-economic change, which associates that endemic poverty, unemployment, the situation that Fidel describes of, children running around barefoot in the countryside with parasites, and a massive proportion of the population with no access to electricity, to doctors, no employment, and so on. They are signing up to tackle those socio-economic conditions, and very much associating that with Cuba's relationship with the United States. The fact that Cuba was under these contracts with the United States, the sugar quota. So every year the US would decide how much of sugar would be imported from Cuba, and that was a mechanism of control, a leverage to say to the Cubans, we don't like what you're doing or a policy you're pursuing, then we can change the sugar quota. But also the Cuban market, let's say, was wide open to US exports. And And this meant, it was very hard for domestic industry, domestic production to take place because, it wasn't in the interest of these sectors in the United States that had a very close market in which to dump their products.
Fascinating. So now, after the revolution, Castro and his supporters gained control of the power, and the island nation of now 11 million people slowly migrates away, looking for alternative model of development, not just growth, but development, as you bring it up in the book, and they choose Soviet Union model. How dependent Cuba became on Soviet Union?
So I don't think it's quite right historically to say that they chose the Soviet model. I think it's more correct to say that they decided that adopting socialism, that is a centrally planned economy which prioritizes social well-being or human well-being, that was the correct model. And in fact, there was a fervent debate in Cuba between its leading revolutionaries, between people in the ministries, about which economic management system should be adopted for Cuba in its current conditions in transition to socialism. And there were those proponents of adopting, like more or less blanket copying, the Soviet economic planning and management system. But there were also those led most vociferously by Che Guevara, who argued that, pointed to deficiencies in the Soviet system of economic planning and management, and argued that Cuba had to find its own way, and indeed that Cuba could learn from and adapt some of the advanced management techniques and technology that were in Cuba bought by the capitalist corporations. So it's a very interesting story. When the nationalizations take place, Che Guevara is at that point the head of the Department of Industrialization, which is within INRA, the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, initially, until February 1961, when it becomes the Ministry of Industries in its own right. And Che is, as they are nationalizing these US corporations, mainly US, some from other countries, which happens in this very dynamic period of tit-for-tat retaliations between the two countries. And the files get to come to Che's desk, and he's looking through and he wants to know, how does the Cuban American Electric Company work? How do the oil refineries work? And what mechanisms do they use for organizing their budgets, for hierarchies of management and so on? And he actually is impressed with the level of efficiency that they use. He notices the way they operate with budgets. So if you have two entities that are linked to one corporation, they don't charge, when they transfer products, they don't charge a profit from each other. They see it as a movement of internal funds, and they just move. It's an accounting movement. So actually, Che Guevara develops a unique system of economic management for socialism, which adopts some of those mechanisms and is even called the budgetary finance system. So that's the first thing to say. I would put it this way, that the Cubans decided that socialism was the best development model for them to answer the historical challenges that they faced as an underdeveloped country. The question of how can underdeveloped countries get the capital that they need to invest in domestic infrastructure and social well-being to prioritize the well-being of their population, and how can underdeveloped countries use international trade to their benefit in a context of what many analysts have called the deteriorating terms of trade. So poorer countries that focus on agricultural goods or other primary sources are always losing the value of their products in relation to the industrial manufacturing products that come from the advanced capitalist countries. So these are, there's a lot, when we analyze Cuba, people tend to focus on Cuban exceptionalism, but actually I find it more useful to see Cuba, the extent to which Cuba faced a universal problem, and that is the challenge of development for the global South in a globalized world, in subsequently in a neoliberal world, Cuba is trying to use a very unfair international system of exchange, trade, finance, and so on, but for the benefit of its own population. So they ultimately determined that socialism is the best model for doing that, a planned economy which prioritizes not profit but people's welfare. Now, there is a debate as well in the literature about whether this was always the intention of Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries in Cuba. And there's also the element of, that part of the leadership of the movement of the 26th of July and other elements in Cuba who supported the revolution against dictatorship and then claimed that they had been betrayed in the turn to socialism and the alliance with the Soviet Union. I mean, quite clearly, in the context of the 1950s, 60s, the Cold War, it would have been more or less impossible for the Cuban Revolution to have survived without an alliance with the Soviet Union. I mean, the whole world was divided into spheres of influence, and Cuba was 90 miles from the United States. So it's, the US had all this control that I've been describing over the Cuban economy, over its political system, over its international relations. And they used that leverage when the revolution happened. For example, the first thing they did is announce that they would cut the amount of sugar they were going to purchase from Cuba. Then they instructed oil refineries not to process oil that was being shipped from the United States after they cut off some exports to Cuba. So they used their control over the Cuban economy to try and make sure that the new revolutionary government didn't have a chance to stabilize and consolidate. So in that context, a small island nation, which is by its nature and inherently dependent on international trade, was obliged to turn to the Soviet Union for assistance. And of course, in the geopolitics of the Cold War, this was a wonderful opportunity for the Soviet Union. But we should also be clear, it's not an opportunity that they were involved in creating, and it's not an opportunity that they saw very, very quickly. Even in 1959, the Soviets apparently, according to research, had shown very little interest and knew very little about the Cuban Revolution or its leading members. But ultimately, yes, in the context of the Cold War, the tit-for-tat relations, Cuba adopted socialism and it entered into a very important alliance with the Soviet Union. And it was not an alliance without problems or criticisms or falling out and breakups and makeups. All of these things happened. And it's far more interesting to analyze what happened and why than, to have a sort of blanket analysis, which has been the very lazy interpretation of many analysts that Cuba was somehow a satellite of the Soviet Union. And this argument was predominating even while evidence was coming out to show that the relationship was far more complex and far more contradictory. For example, Cuba's intervention in Africa, where it was sending troops, most well known is that it went to assist Angola when it was attacked by the army of the apartheid South Africa. But Cuba sent soldiers and advisors all over Africa to assist with their struggles for national independence and so on. And this was not something that was initiated by the Soviet Union. So all of the evidence is there. They were in an alliance with the Soviets, and to a large extent it was mutually beneficial. And there is no doubt that Cuba, the Cuban Revolution was able to stabilize and consolidate with that assistance. But the assistance also brought problems for Cuba, and there were contradictions.
And that actually jives very well into my next question, and that is how dependence or alliance with Russia was different than the dependence on the United States. I mean, there are obviously there were different relationships, in one case they were dictated to, in another case there was more of a trade and barter and participation.
Yeah, well, I think to answer that, you have to be able to distinguish. You have to be able to distinguish between, an imperialist system which is driven by the profit motive. U.S. interests owned a great extent of Cuba and Cuban businesses. I mean, it's like 90% of the electricity system and railways, 40%, but it had reduced to 40% by the 1950s of sugar. And, you know, why were they there? They were there to make a profit. But the relationship with the Soviet Union was very different. The Soviets didn't own most of the property in Cuba, weren't making a profit out of it. They were benefiting in geopolitical terms. That's certainly true. And to an extent, we can say that they benefited economically. So, for example, Cuba has quite a major international, in international terms, major reserve of nickel, and the Soviets helped them to increase and expand production, and they sold nickel to the Soviet Union, and that cost the Soviet Union a lot less than it did from buying from an alternative route or carrying out their own production in geological conditions where it was highly expensive to access. The same with citrus. Apparently the Soviet Union was purchasing citrus, I'm talking about fruits, from Morocco, and they could then switch and buy them from Cuba at a lower price. It is also true that Cuba benefited massively from sugar that was bought at above world market prices. That's true. But the problem is, every time that is stated, what is not stated is actually most sugar traded internationally was on some contract with a fixed price, and only 10% of the sugar traded internationally was at a free market price. So, you know, Britain is trading with its colonies and former colonies in the Caribbean for sugar, and that's at a fixed price. But, you know, people always pick up on the deal for Cuba. The idea is that the Soviet Union, you know, in the fraternal community of socialist nations, is supposed to be assisting the development of the poorer countries. And that's something that Che Guevara went and argued for very strongly in forums with other socialist countries. He actually condemned the Soviet Union for not offering better deals to other socialist countries and newly independent countries. And it's all linked to his analysis of the law of value. And the law of value is, you know, a sort of law that determines capitalism, and it constantly, conditions deteriorate, as I said, for poorer countries. So, I mean, the other question is, you know, the Soviet support to Cuba, if you try to quantify it, then you also have to counterbalance that with the cost of the United States blockade, which of course was implemented from the 1960s and fully in 1961. You know, the Soviets were stepping in because of the United States not only closing its own markets, but then subsequently ensuring that Cuba couldn't access other markets, first informally. So, for example, there's a lot of documentation from 1960, 1961, 1962, the US presidential office and the White House sending letters trying to pressure, and it's succeeding ultimately, the British Prime Minister not to allow a sale of Leyland buses to Cuba. So, you know, first it's informal pressure on other countries, don't trade with Cuba, the pressure in the Organization of American States on other Latin American countries that the whole of Latin America, except Mexico, cuts off diplomatic and economic relations with Cuba. So, you know, the Soviet assistance has to be sort of calculated as a counterbalance to all of the damage and all of the loss that is done by US sanctions and attempt to isolate Cuba politically and economically.
Moving the story further, the next milestone that would be important in the journey or evolution of Cuban history is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the USSR. That had some major impact on Cuba's leaders and the nation. Especially at one point you brought out that the oil shipment dropped from 13 million tons to 1 million tons in less than 3 years, and then it just suddenly dropped completely.
Yes, the impact on Cuba was really severe. I would say catastrophic, but Cuba survived, so I'm not sure if that's the appropriate word. What's interesting, I mean, the signs were there for Cuba that the Soviet Union was pulling away, reneging on previous agreements, and you know, demanding that all trade within the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance be carried out at market prices and so on. And of course, in terms of, what the expectations of the Cuban leadership, Fidel Castro had certain warnings that had been written by Che Guevara in the 1960s, his letter before he leaves Cuba, but also his what's called his critical notes on the Soviet Manual of Political Economy, where he warns about the direction in which the Soviet Union is going, because it's also very interesting to note that in the 1960s, Che Guevara was already arguing, not because he's looking in a crystal ball or taking a guess, but based on his own experience and analysis, that the Soviet Union, or rather that capitalism was returning to the Soviet Union. And then the other interesting thing is that Fidel Castro gives this speech in 1989, 26th of July, and he says in the speech, if one day the Soviet Union were to collapse, we would be left alone, isolated, and the United States would not allow even a piece of grain or a drop of whatever of food to come into our country, but we would survive, we would continue to be socialist. And when he said that, I spoke to people who in the book it's quoted, they said this was a shock, like a thunderbolt out of the air for most Cubans, the idea that the Soviet Union wouldn't be there to support the Cuban Revolution, to continue this relationship with the Soviet Union. But it was almost a year and a half later when finally the Soviet Union collapses. Of course, there's the sort of domino effect. First, you have the Berlin Wall and so on, and countries in the socialist bloc of Eastern Europe, have a transition to socialism. So Cuba is left isolated politically and economically, and at this point, it's 86 to 87% of trade and investment is with the Soviet bloc. So it's interesting that it's not 100%. They do have, over 10% of their trade is carried out with the capitalist world, let's say, and suddenly, that's just gone, right? And what that means for Cuba is not just that the trade can't continue, but even like machinery, infrastructure, they can't get spare parts. They can't, the whole fuel system in refineries is being converted. So it's, and the electric system, it creates incredible difficulties for Cuba. But the first thing is that the government, activates its sort of mobilizes its emergency responses and so on. And the government states that we will continue to be socialist. And the following years were extremely difficult. You had a collapse of GDP of 35% in 3 years. And there were shortages in every sector. When you talk about the reduction in oil imports, that of course affects transport, yes, but it also affects electricity. And, when you think about hospitals and their generators, you think about when you have a blackout in your home, it's not just the light that goes, but also the fridge goes. So any food you had goes off, and, boiling, searing heat in Cuba and no air fans and so on. So, any of your listeners who come from underdeveloped countries which have these sorts of structural problems will say, well, we know that. But, for people listening who haven't been used to those sorts of conditionings, it's worth just thinking it through and what it meant. And they got through it. They basically, interestingly, there was only one violent protest in that whole period, which was a protest that it started on the Malecon in Havana, and people were leaving on rafts and going to the United States, because of course there is the major pull factor for Cubans that they had at that point a very exceptional status in the United States. They could turn up legally or illegally and be granted residency immediately, and within 1 year, first it was 2 years, then it was 1 year, they could be granted citizenship and assisted with housing and employment and so on. So a major pull factor for Cubans to leave. And of course the conditions were really hard, and this was for a population that had been used to, like, in relative to the region, fairly high standards of living. If you look at the situation in terms of healthcare and education, which of course are free. In Cuba today, 96% of the population own their own home. And if they have to pay rent, legally it can't be more than 4% of income. So, if you are, people fixate on Cuban salaries and the value of Cuban salaries. But the point is, a salary there are different requirements of a Cuban salary. if you're Cuban, your salary doesn't have to usually pay for your housing, your healthcare, your education, and all of these other elements that are, part of what a salary has to cover in Britain, in most of Latin America, most of the world. So the circumstances were extremely hard. But what's also interesting, if you look at, from a macroeconomic point of view, you can compare what was happening in those other countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They were going through their own transition. Cuba is going through a transition because it has to change everything. It has to change the structure of its economy. So it ceases to be dominated by sugar exports, which were predominantly to the Soviet Union. It becomes a service exporter. First of all, in the 1990s, they open up the tourism industry. So tourism is a service sector. They become, the main earnings is from services. Subsequently, this is medical services, medical professionals exported all over the world. But they also have to change their trade partners. So they go from having around 10% of their trade with non-socialist countries to having 90% of their trade. And this process is extremely traumatic, but incredibly incurs very little political trauma, as I said, just one protest. And essentially, I'm arguing, and I was living in Cuba in 1995, that this reflects a commitment from the vast majority, and not all, of the Cuban population, that they were prepared to stick with the socialist government and club together, look for creative and collective solutions and get through the crisis, which is what happened.
Fascinating. As you explained very well in the book, is that much of the difficult period where the economy or the GDP contracted by almost 1/3, people came together, stayed together. There was not much of violence or protest, and people tried to negotiate. But Cuba, the Cuban government, also paid some heavy price. And there maybe you can explain, the more they try to get away from the United States, they ended up with the dual currency just to attract the capital, primarily from the Cuban diaspora living in the United States and Europe, to send the foreign exchange. What happened to the dual currency, and how Cuban government negotiated and helped to revive the economy? Because after a few years, the Cuban government deficit came down to almost less than 2%, and then it was almost close to a surplus.
Yeah, so actually I would say that the dual currency was in Cuba with the special period, the economic crisis. The dollar was circulating and its value was going up and up against the Cuban pesos, and it was illegal. So what the Cuban government did is legalize a situation that already existed, and that enabled it to extraordinarily quickly get the use of the dollar under control. So there are slightly varying statistics, but the dollar had gone up to 175, 195 pesos per dollar, and very quickly after legalizing it and setting up government sites where dollars could be exchanged for Cuban pesos, they got that down to, I think, first 28 Cuban pesos when I was first there, and then eventually it settled around 24, 25. But they also introduced something called the Cuban convertible pesos. Many of your readers who've been to Cuba will have seen it, know it. It's the Cook. And that was pegged to the level of the US dollar, but allowed them subsequently in the early 2000s to physically remove the dollar from circulation. So they had this dual currency, yes, but it was two currencies controlled and printed by the Cuban bank. So that was the situation all the way up. I mean, this had benefits. In the immediate period, it got that black market use of the dollar under control. And with the opening of tourism and tourists coming from around the world, many of them bringing the US dollar, the government set up tourist shops and also controlled the hotels and places where people were spending money. It allowed them to, in a sense, harvest the dollars and to use them, put them in the central coffers, and then use them for the essential imports that the country had to make for its to survive, but also to invest in its infrastructure and so on, education and healthcare. But at the same time, you had different rates of exchange in different entities. So state enterprises were using an exchange rate of 1 cook to 1 Cuban national pesos, and while it was on the street 24.25, not just on the street, in retail and everywhere else. And ultimately what this did is create huge disincentives for companies, particularly those exporting, to increase their productivity and efficiency. Because, for example, for them to sell 50, I don't know, say you're selling a cigar for one Cuban pesos each, you could sell 50 internally, and it's 50 Cuban pesos in national money, which is the equivalent of $2. But if you sold them externally, you would sell them for 50 cook, as the equivalent of $2. So none of this, so this is sort of getting getting tangled up in the detail. But what I'm trying to say is that the dual currency, and it was known by the Cubans, it's not something that they denied or they didn't see for themselves. They had their own analysis and critique. The dual currency was creating a situation where there was very little incentive, particularly in the state sector, to increase productivity and efficiency. And it made accounting very difficult, which is always the case when you've got different exchange rates. So they had declared, I think it was in 2013, their statement came out saying that they were going to unify the currencies. Nothing was said about the rate it would be unified or which currency would be left as the national currency, although I think we all suspected it would be the national pesos. But this process was delayed. So they said they would, in 2013, they said the process has started and it will be complete within 5 years. But by then, you had this other process taking place under the mandate of Raul Castro, and the quite significant opening up engagement with foreign capital and in foreign investors. And in order, they had the Mariel Special Development Zone opened with 3 billion of capital from Brazil, and companies from all around the world lined up to set up in Cuba, to operate in Cuba, to do business with Cuba. But a precondition to that was to do something with their historic debts. So Cuba has these historic debts to the Paris Club, to Mexican investors, to Russia. It had debts, and they come from the 1980s. So a lot of money in the reserves was dedicated to clearing these debts. And the Cubans carried out these negotiations and got incredible deals, actually, in terms of the debt with the old Soviet Union, which of course doesn't exist anymore. But the negotiation was with Russia, and they eliminated, I think it was 90 or 95% of the historic debt, and then which was $35 billion equivalent, so it was not a small amount. And with the remainder that was agreed, was still outstanding, they set up new deals to do with that. And the same with Mexico. The Mexican creditors forgave something like 70% of the debt, and likewise with the Paris Club. So they, this because the reserves were used up dealing with, or a certain amount of the reserves were dedicated to clearing those historic debts as a preconditioning for opening up to new foreign investment. That meant that there was a delay in the process of unifying the currency. It finally took place on the 1st of January this year. And as you said, it has led to inflation. I think that was inevitable, and even the government was warning the population there will be inflation. We're going to raise Cuban salaries, state salaries, by 4 or 5 times, some of them. And that was expected to be sufficient to respond to the rising prices. However, the decision to do it on the 1st of January, obviously it wasn't foreseen the enduring, ongoing impact of the pandemic. I think Cuba had expected they'd opened their borders to tourism again in late November, and they had expected the economic situation to pick up. And that didn't happen because, as we know, from wherever we are in the world, the pandemic has gone on, and its impact has been exhausting, and really has continued far longer, I think, than most people predicted. So yes, you do have a situation now. There is one currency, national currency in Cuba, one pesos, but at the same time, because of the shortage of foreign exchange, which is a direct consequence of sanctions introduced by the Trump administration, measures introduced to stop Cuba getting its earnings from the export of foreign medical professionals who are saving and improving lives around the world, measures to more or less make it impossible now to send remittances to Cuba, to send money into Cuba, measures to scare off foreign investors, to terrify banks so that they don't carry out any financial transactions with Cuba. And all of these measures, you know, and the surge in the pandemic have meant that the Cuban economy is still being battered, and they were forced to open what are called, I think it was at the end of 2019, to open foreign free currency stores, of basically stores for hard currency, which is not, people refer to them as dollar stores, but they're not. They also accept any of the internationally traded currencies. So they've been forced to open those to, you know, once again, the government is trying to harness hard currency so that it can use it for essential imports. In this case, much of those have been dedicated to combating COVID-19. But the opening of the hard currency stores has been very unpopular. It's, you know, is another measure that exacerbates inequality between those Cubans who have access to hard currency and those who don't. And then, of course, it relies on Cubans getting this access. But then, you know, when sanctions are taken to make it almost impossible to receive remittances in Cuba, to receive international payments, every step that Cuba takes to try and, you know, meet the challenge, to resolve a problem, to every sort of workaround has been identified by the US administration under Trump, and they have made moves to eliminate it and basically to continue to squeeze the Cuban economy and make life very, very difficult.
So as the global circumstances change, Cuba evolves and adapts to new realities, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, builds a very solid foundation of relationship with the neighboring nation, Venezuela. And there the oil diplomacy, Oil for Doctors, was a very successful program and this is one of the masterpiece or masterstroke of the Cuban leadership, where both countries benefited enormously.
Yeah, the relationship with Venezuela was extremely beneficial. It was often said that Cuba's dependence on Venezuela is, you know, just replaced its dependence on the Soviet Union. But in fact, it was qualitatively and quantitatively different. Venezuela only ever accounted for something like 35% of Cuba's trade, as opposed to nearly 90%. But also, again, it was mutually beneficial. So, you know, Chavez comes along as leading the Bolivarian revolution, and he makes a set of commitments to the population, and they include the social missions, the access to health and education. And the Cuban assistance in carrying out those missions was essential to Chavez's program, to the Bolivarian revolution, and to his enduring popularity. You know, it just simply wasn't possible to train new Venezuelan medics who could go into the barrios as quickly as the Cubans in that short period of time, and in those numbers that the Cubans did. You know, at one point there was 28,000 Cuban healthcare professionals in Venezuela, and they were meeting the needs of underserved populations. Many barrios had never seen doctors. You know, many of these neighborhoods had never had access to medics. And also the literacy campaign, which was phenomenal. You know, Chavez's program was based on changing the constitution and then the new constitution. You remember those images, he used to walk around with the constitution in his hand. But that depended on Venezuelans having the ability to read, which many of them didn't until the Cubans arrived with their literacy campaign and their years of experience, their phenomenal experience in literacy campaigns. And very quickly the population became literate. But in the process of doing that, they discovered that many people were unable to read because they had easily reversible blindness, so glaucoma or cataracts, for example. And the consequence is, Chavez, talking to Fidel Castro, they set up what's called Operación Milagro, Operation Miracle, which is initially to take poor Venezuelans with easily reversible blindness to fly them to Cuba, and they'll have a 5-minute operation and reverse their blindness, be looked after so they recovered there, and then sent back. And then gradually this program moves to Venezuela. So Cuban specialists go to Venezuela and train in Venezuela. They set up centers in Venezuela. And then this gets expanded as through what's called ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, which is set up first with Cuba and Venezuela in 2004, and then extended or added to by new radical governments that are elected in Latin America. So we're talking about Evo Morales in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, in Ecuador, in several countries. Honduras even joins ALBA for a few days before the coup is carried out that removes President Zelaya in 2009, and also quite a few nations in the Caribbean. So they join ALBA, and ALBA is a mechanism for expanding this kind of exchange between countries, focusing on their socio-economic strengths and their needs. So what resources do we have that you lack? And exchange was carried out, without paying attention, again, like the proposal of the socialist bloc, without paying attention to the market price, without paying attention to the profit motive. And so incredible things, exchanges were carried out, but I think it was much more limited because it depended on collaboration to some extent by private interests in those countries, with the government just encouraging it to take place. But the exchange with Venezuela continues. It can, just to be clear, Cuba rather still has 20,000 medical professionals in Venezuela. However, because of problems in Venezuela, the US sanctions on Venezuela have also created a very hard hit for Venezuela, and it's affected their oil production. So Cuba is still operating on the basis of, exchanging its medical professionals in Venezuela for oil. Now, when Venezuela was unable to meet the quota or the amount of oil exports it was sending to Cuba, Cuba had to find alternative sources. And of course, this demanded that they have hard currency to purchase from alternative sellers who would risk selling to Cuba in the context of US hostility and persecution by the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, who would risk selling to Cuba and at higher prices with money that Cuba would not have had to spend. And this was one of the other motivations for opening up the hard currency stores recently.
The fascinating part of the story is that Cuba's commitment in providing health care, inexpensive health care or cheap health care, whatever you call, outside Cuba, just did not extend to Caribbean or Latin American countries, but they carried out similar programs in Africa, and also they were there when other countries needed them during the international humanitarian crisis, like even in Pakistan and the Chernobyl experience.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on Cuban medical internationalism where I explain that, this actually started very early on in the revolution. In fact, 1960 was the first time the revolutionary government sent medics overseas, and that was to Chile after a terrible earthquake in Chile, and they didn't have good relations with the government. So that was one of the characteristics. They're not concerned about, diplomacy. They're not doing this for the relationship with the government. And that was the same in the case you just mentioned when they sent people to Pakistan after the terrible earthquake there. So 1960 the first time, and then there's different forms of medical internationalism, and some of them are responding to an emergency, but you also have the kind of agreements that were set up all over Africa in the 1970s and 80s, which is to help those countries to establish a public healthcare service or system. And, the Cuban medics are out there providing healthcare and medicine that is free at the points of service. And they are saving lives, as I said, and improving lives all around the world. So by the time the Ebola outbreak happens in West Africa, where suddenly the world notices, because the Cubans send the largest group of people who stay the longest to combat Ebola in West Africa in 2014. But by then, Cuba had already sent something like 76,000 medics to Africa over the preceding years. So this has been a feature of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution has never been a domestic project. It has always been an internationalist project. I mean, they've sent people to the South Pacific. They've sent people all over Latin America. And there is this incredible history, and trying to write about it in one chapter, I barely scratched the surface, because you can write a whole book just about one of their projects in South Pacific, about which almost nothing is known. So you have this incredible fact that around this time, 2015, by then, something like, some people say higher, but I think it depends on who you include in this statistic, but something like 400,000 Cubans have been on medical missions overseas. 400,000, when you think that the population of Cuba today is just over 11 million. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. Cuba has more medics working around the world than the whole of the World Health Organization. And even when the COVID pandemic began, suddenly people noticed that the Cuban medics were in, I can't remember how many countries at that time, but during the pandemic, they have sent teams of epidemiological, that's disease control and specialists. They've sent them to 40 or more countries around the world. Thousands of people who've gone, to combat this highly infectious disease. They risk in their own lives. And the situation with Ebola is even more of a risk for their own lives. And these programs, these emergency response programs, historically and on the whole, have not been something that Cuba has received any payment for. So, you can't understand that unless you actually look at the roots of the revolution, the ideological and political impulses of the revolution, the influence of Jose Marti and his statement that the homeland is humanity. In other words, we struggle for ourselves and we struggle for the rest of the world at the same time.
Cuba is a poor nation, but it is one of the very few nations that actually helps other poor nations. No other wealthy nation actually steps up, even when it comes to the troubles in Africa or Latin America or even Central America or in Asia, where Cuba does stand up.
It's one of these extraordinary things that it's quite a threat, really, to the advanced capitalist countries. This model that Cuba shows, first of all, in a poor country, a developing country, you can invest in the right way in health and education, medical science, other forms of science and technology, art, music, culture, and to the point where you are outstanding globally. I mean, Cuba has more art instructors than anywhere in the world. It has more teachers and doctors per capita, per person, than anywhere in the world. So what happens when you don't have a profit-based system? And this is, in a sense, Cuba's problem. It is the threat of a good example. But also beyond that, what Cuba has done for the rest of the world. I think that is reflected in the support that Cuba receives every year at the United Nations. They take a resolution to condemn the US blockade, and they, since the first time when the vote was put, I think it was 93 or 94, they have won that vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations. But, in the last, 10, 15 years, it's been almost every country in the world has voted with them, with the exception of the United States and Israel. And that's obvious why, because A, there is respect for Cuba's determination and resilience and resistance to US imperialism, and the fact that it has a development model which prioritizes both sovereignty and social justice. But B, because, the Cubans, there are beneficiaries of Cuba's health and education system all over the world.
And what is an interesting thing about it is that most of these people, in hundreds of thousands, Cubans who have been all over the world, they have every day, every minute an opportunity to defect and come to the United States, but very few actually do it, and almost all of them return back home.
Well, yes, it's true that some have done that. Even the New York Times came out with an editorial when the Cuban medics were combating Ebola in West Africa. And it was saying, on the one hand, because I think the State Department, the Secretary of State had come out and applauded Cuba and the cooperation because the US was also there. Obama complimented, or that was subsequently with the speech around rapprochement, complimenting the Cuban efforts. But at the same time, they have a program in place to encourage Cuban medical professionals to defect. It was called the Medical Parole Program. And in fact, that stayed in place through most of Obama's 2 mandates and was only revoked a few days before he left office. And it said that any doctor could, go to the nearest consulate and say, I want to sign up for the Medical Parole Board. And they would abandon, as the Cubans say, abandon their mission and go to the United States. Estimates are that up to 2% of Cuban medical professionals have taken that opportunity, even though all the doors were opened for them. However, it's also worth pointing out that once they got to the United States, their medical qualifications were not recognized. So they would then have to continue to work in their profession, they would then have to retake their whole training and their qualifications, but this time in a privatized system where they'd have to pay for that education, which of course they didn't have to in Cuba. And not only that, it would imply for many of them learning English first. So the medical parole program was really quite insidious, nasty program that was to the detriment of those patients overseas and not particularly beneficial to the Cubans who decided to accept the offer to abandon their missions.
So that obviously leads to one of the most important questions that you bring up in the book, and that is when the world changes, Cuba change, and when things get bad or difficult, Cuba always has managed to adapt and find new solutions. But all this thing is done under very difficult and tight U.S. blockade. And sometimes U.S. has threats, intimidation, violent aggressions, and they try to isolate Cuba as much as they can, but none has worked. The obvious point most people had was that when Castro passes away, the whole regime will fall and things will be back to normal as they were before. That didn't happen. And in fact, Cuba has now survived much longer than it has under the, if we use the phrase, reliance on the Soviet Union aid. So there's something there that supports this revolution at a far deeper level.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Cuba is not a dogma or a doctrine. It's a country of people, and there are people who are doing what they can to improve the situation in their own country. But I think we also need to understand the very, very deep roots of the demands for sovereignty and social justice, which are deeply embedded in the Cuban Revolution. So they see, as I said, if you look at even the new constitution, you look at the documents that have come out over the last few years, 2017, there were documents on conceptualizing Cuban socialism, the guidelines for the new economic and political policy. They have this series of sort of adjectives to describe Cuba, what it is and should be. And they are, sovereign. Sovereign comes very high up that list, independent, democratic, socialist. And sustainable development have also become very important features. And I would say that, that's what the Cuban Revolution means to the Cuban people. So I don't know whether that's, it wasn't really a question, but I don't know whether that's addressed that. It's worth saying, yeah, you're right. When I first started reading about Cuba in English language academic texts, when I went to university and so on, we were always told that Cuba couldn't survive without the Soviet bloc. And now, of course, it has survived for longer without it than with it. And then, we were also told, when Fidel dies, or when Fidel leaves power, and then Raúl took over and things continued. And then when Fidel dies, and now that's how many years? 5 years or something? So, yeah, clearly the Cuban Revolution was not a Castro brother, and the Cuban Revolution wasn't an ideology. It is about a people who rose up against their exploitation and oppression and carved out their own way forward. Now, that doesn't mean for any minute that, you know, the survival of the Cuban Revolution, Cuban socialism is certain. It doesn't mean that they can cope with anything. I would say that the situation in Cuba today is extremely hard. Daily life has become really, I mean, I'd say intolerable, but up to this point, you know, they are enduring. But the daily shortages, I mean, you know, 243 new sanctions, actions and measures were introduced by the Trump administration. But remember, that's to add to 60 years of sanctions and 6 very big, complex, distinct laws which make up the US blockade. And, you know, at the point where you would have thought, well, what more can they do? They found 243 new measures to make it even harder for Cuba to survive. And the result is shortages in every sector. Once again, the shortages of food. The Cuban, I've recently returned from Cuba, the Cuban household that I live in, like every household in Cuba, people are getting up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning to join queues for scarce goods when the stores that they're outside, the goods might not even have come in yet. And they're doing that before a day of work or a day of caring. So daily life has become extraordinarily difficult once again for Cuba. And the new Biden administration has now appears to have made clear that he didn't intend to fulfill his campaign promise to reverse some of the sanctions, the most brutal sanctions. There is some discussion about whether he'll allow remittances, but that will be very difficult while they still have all of these restraints on the banking system. So I'm a British citizen, and it's extraordinarily hard for me to do any exchange or interaction with Cubans or Cuban entities, even though there is a law in Britain from 1996 saying that it is illegal to implement the US sanctions, which are a national issue for the United States, on British citizens and entities, and that's a problem. So yes, the Cuban revolution has survived to now, but it is going through a very, very difficult period. And part of the problem is that the rest of the world hasn't stood up to the US, and the US sanctions have taken on an unprecedented level of squeezing the Cuban economy and squeezing the Cuban people. If you think that in the context of the pandemic, the US approved another 54 or something actions and measures against Cuba. The Cubans, very early on in the pandemic, seeing how the disease was, the pattern of the disease, where it was hitting places, they tried to import new medical ventilators for their ICU units. And they were unable, because the Swiss companies that had sold them the ventilators had been bought out by a US subsidiary. So they couldn't even get the spare parts for their existing ventilators. So you think how cruel and punitive US sanctions are. It's really no surprise that some people in Cuba took to the streets and protested on the 11th of July. I mean, after all, that was the original intention of the US blockade, and it was articulated in that document by Lester Mallory on the 6th of April 1960, where he said, the Cuban Revolution, Fidel has too much support. What we need to do is use economic mechanisms to create hunger and desperation. Those are his words. Why? Because only then will we see the overthrow of government. In other words, we have to make Cuban populations suffer in order to see any kind of revolt against their government and their leadership.
Where does Cuba go from here now? I mean, one of the key revenues they have is the international tourism, and obviously because of the pandemic that has pretty much collapsed, even though Cuba is now one of the top destinations in the Caribbean travel. And I think in January Cuba announced that they're going to devalue their currency almost to the tune of 90-95%. Where does Cuba adapt to a new form of life if the pandemic continues for another year or two?
Thing to say is that the Cubans have recently announced that they're going to reopen their borders and in a gradual process to international visitors and tourists from the 15th of November. Why are they able to do this? Because their national vaccination campaign which, you know, started later than other countries, but has been proceeding at an incredible pace, which, you know, for those of us who know the Cuban public healthcare system, we predicted that would be the case. So by the end of November, they should have almost all, if not all, of the Cuban adult population triple vaccinated, because it's free vaccines in Cuba, but they will also have the child population vaccinated from 2 years up. So Cuba has just started its childhood vaccination program. It's the first country in the world that will start vaccinating, mass vaccinating from 2 years up. And that means that they have the confidence with the efficacy that the vaccine has demonstrated in protecting people from the severe and serious illness by COVID-19, that they will have the confidence to open up their borders. So we should see a return to tourism as a key source of revenue for Cuba, certainly from the end of this year or the year 2022. So my message to people who feel, oh, I have never visited Cuba, or I haven't been for years, you know, book your ticket now for 2022, because Cuba will be opening its doors, and it will be one of the safest places in the world, certainly a lot safer than most of the global south, who we can't envisage having their populations fully vaccinated for many years down the line.
Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for talking to us. We have been speaking with Dr. Helen Yaffe, the author of We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Managed to Survive in a Post-Soviet World. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish.